My name is Kelly Mulville, and I'm originally from West Texas. I got involved in wine growing a little bit later in life. I had been involved with all kinds of agriculture since I was a kid, including growing chilies in West Texas. And I got started in organic farming as a kid, basically at about 16 years old. So my history has been kind of bouncing around between livestock production and agricultural crops, in particular fruit crops and wine grapes, which is also a fruit crop. So it was with wine grapes that I really started getting into this whole idea of regenerative cropping practices and what those look like. And during that process, I was thinking a lot about, okay, how do I take the things that I've learned in holistic management and ecosystem processes and healing lands and parlay that into viticultural practices. And when I ended up in California, I started working on the idea of integrating animals into vineyard systems, which is not an uncommon thing. It's becoming more common to use primarily sheep in vineyards during the non-growing season of the vines, which is winter. So as soon as we get our rains in fall and we have enough growth, which is usually not until January, so people will put sheep in vineyards. And so I started messing around with that a little bit and quickly realized that the best results we could get is if we could graze sheep in vineyards during the growing season of the vines, because that correlates as well with when you have the maximum production of cover crops. The problem with that is that sheep love to eat grapevines. And so putting sheep into a vineyard during the growing season of the vines can be really problematic. So that was an obvious problem to be overcome. Worked on that on that thought process of, okay, how do we integrate animals into a cropping system like a vineyard, and came up with a pretty simple system based off of using electric fencing technology. I did a trial with that in Sonoma County and ended up writing an article on the results of that. And because of that, I ended up doing some initial work in both Australia and New Zealand, consulting and doing presentations. It wasn't until I left the country that I got invited back to do presentations. And so when I came back to do a presentation, one of those was at Eco Farm, and the owner of Piscinas Ranch, Sally Calhoun, was at that presentation. And in that, I talked about the work I'd done modifying existing vineyards to bring in livestock to help control weeds and cover crops, and the results of that work. And I'd actually met with Sally beforehand. She was interested in putting in a vineyard here at Piscinas Ranch. And I said, well, this is the realm that I want to work in. And so if you come to this presentation and are still interested in following this trajectory that I'm on, then let's talk. So at the end of that presentation, I talked about modifying existing vineyards, but I said the real work that needs to happen here is that we need to design our agricultural systems so that we can incorporate livestock, because of all the benefits that we're discovering from this. And otherwise, we're just modifying existing systems that were never designed to utilize livestock to their full potential. So as a result of that comment after the presentation, Sally asked me to come out to Piscinas Ranch and showed me around and told me the history of this place. And part of the interesting history of Piscinas Ranch is the ranch totals 7,600 acres, and it used to be part of Almaden Vineyards, which was the largest varietal wine grape vineyard in the country. 1,000 acres of that 6,000 acre total vineyard was on Piscinas Ranch. So this ranch has a history of wine grape growing. But when Sally purchased this ranch, there was only 80 acres of the vines left, and they were all removed by the time I got here about 6.5 years ago. I looked over the site and it looked promising, and she was actually open to trying this idea of how do we design something from the ground up to work with creating a regenerative vineyard practice. And so started working pretty immediately on determining a site, and then starting to work with all the design elements that would be involved with this. We ended up planting the first phase of the vineyard in 2017, planted the second phase just about 2 months ago. and the total planting is 25 acres. We did not plant the entire 25 acres right off the bat because we knew we were entering a design and somewhat of an engineering process too, and expected there to be mistakes and learnings, which was definitely true. In hindsight, I might have even had a smaller initial planting to allow for the learnings that we have gleaned to go into the second phase. But so far, everything is going good. And as of a few days ago, we did our first introduction of livestock into the vineyard during the growing season. How do we restore our ecosystems? These are some questions that we asked ourselves. How do we restore our ecosystems, our agricultural ecosystems, and continue to produce food? And coming from a background in organic agriculture and holistic management, and Sally coming in with a background in holistic management, the question keeps coming back: if we can't create agricultural practices that enhance or at least maintain healthy ecosystems, then we're just on a gradually, or in some cases steep, decline in agriculture and degrading landscapes. And by doing that, then we're just undermining the possibility of any civilization in the future for humans. So the real challenge is, how do we create agricultural systems that don't just do less damage to ecosystems, but actually improve and enhance ecosystem processes? So it's not necessarily going to look exactly like what was there, but we can use nature as the model. And that's one of, we actually have about 2 pages of principles that we work off of. And that's constantly being updated and rewritten. But ultimately, they all stem from this idea of what can we learn from nature? What has nature already figured out? And how do we mimic that in our practices? And when we do that, can we do it and make it economically and socially sound? That then leads into, okay, what are the practices that we can do? How do we emulate, mimic healthy ecosystems? And one of the first things that was obvious to me was that when we create farming systems, we eliminate animals. And that's one of the reasons why I'm pretty excited that about this conference, and that the vet school is kind of spearheading this, because it really looks like one of the biggest things that we can do to mimic ecosystems is get animals into our agricultural practices. By doing this, then it's kind of like we're putting all these pieces together that we've unraveled. We're bringing in these components of the way an ecosystem functions, and by doing that, we're kind of creating this synergy that if we can guide it in the right way and stay out of it when we need to, stay out of the way when we need to, then we can create these systems that are very self-sustaining. And so that's the trajectory we are on right now. And a big part of that for us is what is, how do we design these systems? And what is the role of design in that? And how do we take the kind of linear approach that is often used in design and make it more holistic so that it fits in the context of natural ecosystems? Probably the big question that people have now is, what does mimicking nature look like in grape growing? And so for us, the first question is, how do we get livestock? In particular, we were looking at sheep, but I have also worked with poultry, in particular geese, chickens to some extent as well. But in particular, how do we get sheep into vineyards? Because there seems to be a natural fit. I suspect there's been sheep in vineyards, maybe not always on purpose, but since there have been vineyards, because sheep were one of the first animals that were domesticated, and wine grapes were one of the first plants that were domesticated. So the first thing is, how do we design a system that allows sheep to have an impact, to be able to graze and browse in those systems at any time of the year? And that any time of the year point was really critical. And that was based on the initial work that I did by having sheep in a vineyard with an electrified system to keep them from browsing the parts that were important and allowing them to browse everything else that would help reduce labor, tractor work. Really, this idea is so simple, it's a little bit scary. But all we did for the design part of this, when we decided not to use the electrified system, but to design so that we didn't have to use an electrified system, was to raise the trellis up. And fortunately, timing worked out well, and a friend of mine who's a viticultural advisor was doing a presentation, and he showed a slide of a trellis system being used in Texas. And I looked at that and I thought, that looks like it would work almost perfectly for what I'm trying to do. So we are basically using just a slightly modified version of this trellis system that's a high trellis system. And the good thing about it is it's also conducive to wider row spacing. So that makes it easier for the sheep to be in the vineyard because they have a little bit more room. In addition, it creates an overhead canopy, which provides shade for the animals during the summer. As kind of when you get down to a good idea, the interesting thing that happened is, as we kept looking into this, we realized, okay, there's a lot of benefits that are coming from this. In addition to providing shade, it's higher up, so it's less prone to frost. It's less prone to mildew pressure because it's an open, high canopy. It has good airflow. It has good sun exposure. All of the important parts of the grapevine that we don't want grazed are out of reach of the sheep. And then it's also, in looking at the bigger picture of climate change, it's providing some coolness to the overall vineyard because of the partial overhead covering. We expect the yields to be pretty much the same as a higher density vineyard because of the specifics of the training practice of the partial overhead divided canopy. We also expect that it's going to be aesthetically a very pleasing environment. In a sense, what we've done is we've been able to maintain the rangeland below and actually enhance that rangeland by increasing the productivity of that. But we've added this additional layer on top that is the grape orchard, the grape vineyard. And so we have two things happening now. We have a full-scale vineyard above a pasture, basically. And so by doing that, we've increased our economic viability and security by having two separate crops that are growing and kind of they're relying on different systems. And so, for instance, if the grapes were to get hailed out, if some other thing happened that reduced or eliminated the grape crop for a year, it's probably really likely that we could still graze the sheep. And then vice versa as well. But in general, we expect most years we will be able to have a good crop of both sheep and wine grapes. And not only will they not detract from each other, but they will enhance each other. This kind of leads to what does happen when you integrate sheep into a vineyard situation like this. What are the benefits? And so from the initial trial work that I did, I was actually pretty surprised by a lot of the benefits that showed up. I was really mainly just trying to control the understory plants in a vineyard by having livestock in there. And they did that, and they did that really well. But it also turns out they did a great job of suckering the vines. The sheep will go through and browse off those suckers all the way to the bark. Normally that work is done by hand labor. It can be not all that fun, especially in the lower vineyards, because you're stooping a lot to remove those suckers, and they're just usually just thrown on the ground. Having sheep in there, they eat those, they run them through their digestive system, and they deposit them back on the ground as fertility. There's another component of that that probably the people working in the vet college may be more familiar with, and that's that when an animal browses or grazes a plant, it usually imparts a benefit to that plant. And oftentimes that is in a kind of a faster recovery of that plant, be it if it's a grass or something like a forb, but it also tends to impart disease and insect resistance. And so by doing that, we suspect that we may be able to get some disease and insect resistance by having the sheep browsing directly on the grapevines, just on the parts where we want them to. In addition, often vines will get rootstock suckers, which you also want to remove, and the sheep do that as well. One of our principles that we use in regenerative agriculture is to reduce or eliminate cultivation. And so we're able to do that with the sheep because they control all of the forbs, weeds, cover crop, whatever it might be in the vineyard by grazing that. So we have no need for tillage. We've actually never tilled the vineyard. We have no need for mowing or under vine cultivation. Those are all expensive, time-consuming, fossil fuel utilizing practices. We're reducing carbon footprint by eliminating those. In addition, because of the design of the system, we have eliminated the need for doing any hedging, which is when the vines grow tall. In most trellis systems, those are usually hedged with a tractor. With our system, when the vines get tall, the shoots lay over the trellis and hang back down into the vineyard where they are fair game for the sheep to browse. That's another labor practice or tractor practice that is being eliminated because of, again, designing the system so that the sheep will do as much as possible. Looking at all those practices, the reduction in tractor use, an average organic vineyard in this state will have about 25 tractor passes a year. We are on a trajectory to, if possible, completely eliminate the use of tractors. And we will be able to do that if we can do our spraying with drones. If we can get to that point with them of perfecting that, then we could potentially have a vineyard that never has to have a tractor in it. There is harvesting that has to occur. And for our purposes, we plan on using something with fat tires like a side-by-side or a quad and a small trailer so that we, again, reduce the floor disturbance and compaction. Looking at the economics of that, I did this initial work with the electrified system about 11 years ago. And at that time, the cost savings per acre averaged about $450 a year. So that's $450 per acre savings per year. Just to give you an idea of what that would mean, in this area, there's a lot of vineyards that are 1,000 acres or more. And so we're looking at over $500,000 savings per year. So that's just savings in input costs. If we also look at, if you combine that with and there's multiple ways you could do this. You could hire a shepherd to bring in sheep. You could buy sheep early in the season, run them through the year, and then sell them at the end of the season. You could borrow sheep from your neighbor if you're a small operation. There's a number of ways to do this. For us here, because we have so much rangeland, we actually have our own sheep flock, and it's up to about, I think we're up to about 700 head right now. We'll probably get up to around 3,000 head. And so in order to graze our vineyard, which is only 25 acres at this point, we can do that pretty quickly at any time of the year. 1,000-acre vineyard would need a lot more sheep, but they could potentially partner, especially like with some young producers who don't have the ability to own land, but they could still be in business as a livestock producer by having contracts with vineyards. In addition to saving money for the vineyard, it's also opening up opportunities for young producers to get into agriculture, and especially in the livestock capacity of agriculture. Another savings that occurred in that trial was in water use, and this was a big surprise to us. So the trial that I did with the electrified system was taken out of a much larger vineyard. And so the control part was this conventionally managed vineyard. I think it was over 100 acres. And we just had a half acre of this trial section. In that trial section, when we grazed the vineyard throughout the growing season, we had a 90% reduction in irrigation use. In conjunction with that reduction in irrigation use, we had about a 1,250 pound increase per acre in yield. So we had a dramatic decrease in water use and a pretty significant increase in yield. Before that, we were using the winter season only grazing. Increase in water savings over that was 80%. So just by getting the sheep in there during the growing season of the vine, we had a significant increase in water savings by extending that grazing season. And that is the 90% increase was over just the conventional practices of using tractors and tillage and things like that. Those were the big takeaways from that trial. And that is what led us to this design process that we're using right now. And again, we feel like we are on a constant trajectory of figuring that out. The second part I wanted to talk about more generally was the ranch and what we're, obviously we're doing a lot of innovation and research and trials and trying to figure out how farming might look like, how farming might function in a more ecologically and economically sane way. So as far as educating the public, that's a big part of what we do here. And one of the primary things I would say about this place is we're open source. So everything we do here, including all of the mistakes we make, we try and record those and let people know about that, what we're doing, what's working, what is not. And so and we're definitely making our share of mistakes, but by opening those up to other people who are considering this, then we just feel like we're increasing the possibility of and creating a community of collaboration where we can have more people looking at these systems from their perspective and having a greater impact in our trajectory of learning how to work within the context of mimicking nature. So we are collaborating with a lot of on-site researchers from other universities, students, farmers, and scientists. And so we actually have a full-time person on staff who is director of research and monitoring and fertility. One of our principles that we're working on is trying to create as much of the fertility for growing our crops here as we can on site. So instead of spending money on fertilizer, we're actually spending money on human ingenuity and research to find out how we go about doing that. And then another realm that we're looking at is how do we educate investors and other philanthropists, because they can play a big role in supporting other innovation in this world of regenerative agriculture. And then along with that, we are looking at how we can educate young people and expose them to the ideas of regenerative agriculture, of mimicking nature in agriculture, and of agricultural design. We do feel like we're laying some initial groundwork, and it will be really exciting to see what we've done surpassed and improved and just take that and really fly with it. Those are kind of the areas. So we're working on trying to innovate and create these systems and develop them and share all of our learnings with as broad of an audience as possible and create the biggest impact that we can.